Don't fall for a bunch of baloney about this popular lunch meat. This is hands down everything you ever need to know about, you guessed it, baloney.
Many people might have viewed bologna as having too much of a mystery meat vibe, of being a little too weird. It's a texture thing, right? It probably doesn't help that as a lunchtime staple, bologna sandwiches have long been given little consideration. White bread, some mayo, and done. Yum?
I hate bologna, like more than anything else in the world. Oh! Spit it out, please don't swallow.
No longer relegated to the category of desperation lunch, bologna sandwiches have recently become the hippest thing since sliced bread. Turkey and the Wolf, a restaurant in New Orleans, makes theirs with locally made bologna, fried on the griddle and piled high on buttered and browned slices of bread with cheese, mustard made in-house, shredded lettuce, and of course, mayo. Then a handful of chips are added for some seriously delicious crunch. Fried bologna isn't just a simple staple anymore. Chefs are frying it and dressing their sandwiches up with all sorts of things, like sweet relish and all different types of cheeses. Others are topping their bologna sandwiches with things like caramelized onions and olives, and still others are subscribing to the idea that you can't have too many fried things on your sandwiches, and adding some fried pickles on there too. Some places don't settle for just frying their bologna, they're smoking it and then serving that up on a sandwich. Today, it's just downright good for the soul, and whether you are enjoying a gourmet version for your next meal out or eating a cold bologna sandwich over your sink, it's time we all started welcoming bologna back into our hearts and stomachs. In moderation, of course. And after, you share your fanciest bologna creations with the rest of the world. During the early 1900s, most kids went home for lunch. By the 1920s and 1930s, many schools had a lunch program where children were either given free meals or meals that cost pennies. During this time, guidelines about what constituted a nutritious lunch were quickly changing, but schools did their best to keep up. How did bologna fit in and become such a popular lunchtime staple? It had a lot to do with the fact that in 1946, President Truman signed the National School Lunch Act, which established the National School Lunch Program. The National School Lunch Program provides low-cost or free lunches to children each school day. Because bologna is a low-cost food, it ended up on a lot of lunch trays and in a lot of lunch bags. Around the same time, grocery stores began offering fresh foods that were packaged to have a longer shelf life than they had previously. Bologna was a lunch meat that was relatively inexpensive, able to keep fresh, and appealed to the taste buds of children. What more could schools and parents want? Packaged bologna sometimes comes with a red string or seal around it. What exactly is that stuff? And can you eat it? There's actually a few possibilities depending on the brand. It might be a casing made from the gastrointestinal tracts of cattle, sheep, and hogs, which makes it slightly gross, but still edible. If it's bright red, though, it's most likely a synthetic casing, which may be made from collagen, plastic, or other fibrous material. Not all bologna has this red casing, and sometimes it's removed before it's sold in stores. When confronted with this question on Facebook, Oscar Mayer replied, quote, "Yup, all the bologna in the package purchased is good to eat," though questions about specific products went unanswered. While red synthetic casings may or may not be edible, it's probably safer to remove them before consumption, unless the packaging specifically states that they're edible. There's a good chance that they're not, and that's a chance you probably don't want to take. A little bit of plastic isn't going to do much to make your sandwich taste better, that's for sure. Even if you're a huge bologna fan, the idea of being locked up in the Dakota County Jail sounds pretty awful and is made more awful by the fact that bologna is all you get. The jail serves 2 turkey bologna sandwiches and a small side dish of fruit per inmate, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, even on Christmas. In Alabama, a sheriff was locked up after feeding the inmates at his jail grits and paper-thin bologna sandwiches. Why such weird cruelty? Wardens in Alabama are allowed to pocket money left over from providing inmates with meals, and bologna is a very inexpensive choice to feed a group of people. In Alaska, 2 Muslim inmates were fed bologna sandwiches during Ramadan and later sued for having their civil rights violated. Infamous Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio not only makes his inmates wear pink socks and underwear, but he has also boasted about serving them rotten food, including green bologna. Most prisons allow access to vending machines and canteen services where incarcerated people can supplement these meager mealtime offerings, but all that talk about bad bologna is enough to make anyone rethink our whole legal system. For those of you who want more bologna with your bologna, why not whip up a delicious, creamy bologna cake? This cake resembles a normal cake until you slice into it and reveal layers of bologna with a zesty cream cheese and ranch dressing frosting between the meat layers. If you think it couldn't get any better than this, you'd be so wrong, because you also decorate this deliciousness with cheese, but not just any cheese. If you want it to be authentic, you'll have to use the stuff in a can. That's right, you decorate the cake with aerosol cheese. Serve it up with some yummy buttery crackers or cocktail bread and watch your friends' faces light up. Who needs a plain old cheese ball when you can have a cheese and bologna cake? Sounds like a pretty delicious football game treat to eat with a nice cold can of PBR as you watch your favorite team fight their way to victory. Americana at its finest. If you thought the only way to eat bologna on a sandwich was to open the package, pull the little red string off, and slap it into bread, you'd be sadly mistaken. Because you can also enjoy the down-home deliciousness of bologna salad. Nobody knows exactly where bologna salad came from. It may have just been an offshoot of ham salad that came into existence when a clever housewife only had bologna in her refrigerator in the 1950s, so she decided to whip that into a bologna salad. But everyone knows someone who has a grandma or an aunt or a cousin who made this. Bologna was cut up and mixed with mayonnaise and pickle relish and sometimes celery. Then you either ate it on white bread or with crackers. Nostalgia food for the win. It's common knowledge that we should all be trying to limit processed foods, including lunch meats like hot dogs and bologna. But how bad is it, really? Well, for one thing, it's got a lot of salt and fat. One slice of bologna contains 7.9 grams of fat and 302 milligrams of sodium, about 13% of your entire daily intake. And who eats just one slice, especially when you're busy digging into one of those delicious bologna cakes? The real risk, though, lies in the nitrates in bologna. Processed foods like bologna and bacon are frequently cured by adding sodium nitrate to them because nitrates can help stop food from spoiling and prevent botulism-causing bacteria from growing. The big downside to eating processed deli meats is that the International Agency for Research on Cancer concluded that when you eat just a 50-gram portion of processed meat every day, you're increasing your risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. Even though that risk is somewhat small, eating less processed meat can decrease your bowel cancer risk. This basically means that bologna should be a sometimes food if you simply can't resist the urge to indulge. The World Health Organization has classified processed meats as a Group 1 carcinogen, like cigarettes and alcohol, which means they recommend it should be avoided entirely. Depressing news, but better to be safe than sorry and swap out your bologna sandwich for peanut butter on occasion. Pretty much everyone has tried bologna at some point, but nobody ever really wants to know what it's made of, or how it's made. But maybe it's time that changed. From pig to plate, this is how bologna is actually made. The name Bologna comes from Bologna, a large city in northern Italy where butchers produce a similar meat called Mortadella, the ancient ancestor of the sandwich filling we know and love today. Mortadella has roots that go all the way back to the Roman Empire, as evidenced by certain pieces of classical Roman art and literature. For example, the Roman author Pliny the Elder once described how the Emperor Augustus, during a visit to the city, found himself particularly impressed with the taste of mortadella. The meat's main wow factor for the Romans was its saltiness. In fact, by the Middle Ages, the people who salt-cured meats such as mortadella had formed a powerful guild that had a significant financial backing in the Italian states. The guild even drove up mortadella costs by up to 9 times as much as a loaf of bread. But this meat has come a long way since those days. Although American producers of bologna might also have big bucks in their bank accounts, bologna certainly isn't the bourgeois meat it once was. The European Union is notorious for regulating the authenticity of a wide variety of food products, from cheese to champagne, and mortadella is no exception. In order for a meat product to be legally considered mortadella back in Italy, it has to meet a number of strict certifications. Namely, authentic traditional mortadella must be made using a pork sausage. No other meats can legally be used in real Italian mortadella. Additionally, authentic mortadella has pieces of fat incorporated in the sausage, giving the slices of the deli meat a characteristically mottled appearance. The ground meat and fat cubes are then combined with spices like salt and pepper and placed in a sausage casing. Unlike other cured meats like salami and prosciutto, mortadella isn't dry cured. Instead, after it's finished cooking, it's sprayed with cool water. As a result, it doesn't have the same bone-dry texture of some of the more well-known cured meats. Of course, it's abundantly clear to anyone familiar with both that American bologna isn't mortadella. It's actually more of a cousin of mortadella, and a distantly related one at that. Since U.S. laws don't strictly regulate what recipes can and can't be called bologna, America's take on the traditional Italian deli meat has taken on a much more dynamic evolution process. A lot of different brands use a variety of different meats and spice blends to produce their own variants of bologna. However, USDA regulations do actually have one strict clause that differentiates America's take on bologna from traditional mortadella. Like hot dogs, American bologna can't have small flecks of fat or spices in it, as the USDA dictates that all the meat and additives must be pulverized into tiny, unrecognizable particles. That's why America's bologna looks so very different from its speckled cousin. But beyond that one detail, it's pretty much fair game as to what can go into your bologna. Different brands and versions use all different kinds of meats, from traditional pork to beef to more off-the-wall renditions like chicken bologna. The USDA does say, however, that the label on American bologna must tell you what kind of meat you're getting. So at least there's that. In typical American fashion, the cut of meat from which bologna is derived has changed considerably from that of its Italian ancestor. While mortadella typically uses meat from the back and cheek of the pig, bologna's makeup consists of what's known as raw skeletal muscle and other raw meat byproducts such as the heart, kidney, or liver.
I love it.
Oh my God, I'm sweating.
Raw skeletal muscle is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the muscular tissue that attaches directly to the skeleton of the pig. This cut of meat is composed mainly of muscle fibers and connective tissues and is a major component for many other highly processed meats, like hot dogs and other pre-cooked sausages. The addition of those other meat byproducts is a way for manufacturers to ensure they get the biggest bang for their buck. Adding in parts of the animal that are more difficult to sell ensures that the whole animal can be marketed. That way, they don't have to dispose of the undesirable remains. Luckily, it is possible to find out if you're getting these byproducts in your bologna. The USDA says these byproducts must be individually named in the ingredients list, as well as what species of animal they come from. Both bologna and mortadella draw on a similar flavor profile, which comes from the unique blend of spices used to flavor the two meats: coriander, celery seeds, nutmeg, black pepper, and myrtle berries. Essentially, this is the same blend of spices used in traditional blends of pickling spices, except, of course, for the myrtle berries. Small amounts of nutmeg and black pepper work to give bologna and mortadella that somewhat warm, comforting flavor. Meanwhile, coriander and celery seed add just the right touch of bitterness to take the edge off all that salt that's blended into the meat. The popular bologna manufacturer Oscar Mayer also includes ground mustard powder, beef stock, and paprika to help make their products stand out from the pack. But what really differentiates mortadella and bologna from their other lunchtime competition is the addition of myrtle berries, which gives them a particular flavor that you won't find in any other deli meats. While bologna is full of plenty of processed parts and chemical additives, myrtle berry is one of the few things you'll find on the ingredients list that is pretty much all natural. It's also one of the key ingredients that has been carried over from mortadella. The myrtle berry is indigenous to the Mediterranean and has found its way into a number of different Italian dishes beyond just mortadella. Myrtle leaves are an especially popular flavoring for roast pork dishes, so it should come as no surprise that its berries are the primary flavoring agent in mortadella, and by extension, its American cousin. In fact, the name mortadella might even be related to the Italian word for myrtle, mirto, since the spice gives the cold cut such a characteristic semi-spicy flavor profile. Myrtle berries themselves have a slightly astringent, citrus-like flavor comparable to juniper berries and rosemary. Myrtle berries are also the main flavor component in a popular Italian liqueur known simply as mirto. This digestif even has a flavor, according to the Huffington Post, that actually kind of tastes like bologna. Nice, huh?
My bologna has a
my first name. It's OSCAR.
Well, that's great, but that doesn't change the fact that there are 18 ingredients in a slice of Oscar Mayer's beef bologna. And that's a whole lot of ingredients for a lunch meat that started out as something relatively simple. And those ingredients aren't all meat and spices either. While things aren't all bad for the brand's cold cuts, there are a number of questionable additives, from corn syrup to a number of strange chemical compounds. Processed meats such as bologna tend to get a lot of flack for potentially having carcinogenic properties. And Oscar Mayer's bologna is no exception. In fact, one of the ingredients in the company's bologna, sodium nitrite, is a common additive in processed meats and might actually contribute to their cancer-causing properties. While sodium nitrite is an effective preservative in bologna, hot dogs, and many other meat-based products, the International Agency for the Research of Cancer has said that ingestion of nitrites is likely linked to higher rates of bowel cancer. One other risky additive in Oscar Mayer's bologna is sodium phosphate, which is generally used to cure meat products and help keep them moist. And while the FDA does consider sodium phosphate to be generally safe to eat in small quantities, it has been linked to elevated rates of mortality for those with kidney disease and cardiovascular disease. So, once you've got all your ingredients together, for better or for worse, just how do you go about making it into bologna? Well, after all of the meat and fats and spices are ground up into a fine mince, the mixture is funneled into a sausage casing. Traditionally, sausage casings are made from animal intestines, often the same kind of animal as the meat from which the sausage is derived. In the case of traditional mortadella, this would be pig intestine, but the jury's out for bologna. Animal intestines can be hard to come by nowadays. In fact, many sausage producers have turned to using a chemically derived sausage casing, often using compounds such as cellulose, collagen, or even plastics. But even traditional Italian mortadella is allowed to contain artificial sausage casings such as these, since it can be inconvenient and expensive to obtain the intestines necessary to create a 100% natural casing. You may find that some of the bologna you purchase in stores has what resembles a red seal around it. This is most likely an artificial casing. Most of the popular brands remove the casing before packaging their bologna. But if you're unsettled at the thought of accidentally ingesting plastic in your next bologna sandwich, then be sure to peel off that red casing if you find it. Oscar Mayer says all of their casings are plant-derived, however. So if you do happen to digest any, there's really no need to panic. As you know by now, the USDA doesn't have the same strict regulations on defining bologna that the European Union has for mortadella. But there is one particularly interesting regulation that really separates American bologna from its Italian cousin. It's essentially mandated by law that bologna be made using a meat batter rather than finely ground up or minced meat. This is why bologna and mortadella look so different, despite having similar flavor profiles. While the base of mortadella is a rather heterogeneous blend of meat, fat, and spices, all those components must be reduced to particles when making bologna in America. Meat batters have a fluid, homogeneous consistency that's created by the emulsion of animal fats and a liquid, while the protein in the meat serves to combine the two liquids into a stable mixture. In order to do this effectively, the proteins in the meat must be ground down to very fine particles, and manufacturers must be very careful about the amount of salt and acidic ingredients they add to the mixture. Otherwise, they risk inadvertently destabilizing the batter. Once the bologna batter has been made, it's funneled into those casings.
I measure out the dry ingredients, I mix in the slurry real slow, and load them all into the extruder.
After the meat and spice emulsion has been transferred to its casing, it's then cooked. This process can differ depending on the brand and variant of bologna, and American bologna is often cooked differently from Italian mortadella. According to the European Union's regulations on producing authentic mortadella, the Italian product is slow-cooked in a warm room for a few hours to a full day, depending on the size of the sausages being cooked. The mortadella making process features dry air heaters that heat up the internal temperature of the sausage to around 158 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the cooking process is complete, it's sprayed with cool water and cooled down to stabilize the product before packaging. In the United States, bologna manufacturers have two options for finishing their bologna products. According to USDA regulations, bologna is a member of a family of processed meats called frankfurters, like hot dogs, which can be either cooked or smoked. Because of this, many bologna brands feature a smoky flavor comparable to bacon. This, of course, is just another factor that differentiates the flavor profile of American bologna from the more highbrow Italian product.
Meat mysteries got you swallowing a load of bologna? Fear not. It's time to set the record straight about America's favorite sausage.
That's a bunch of baloney.
It's easy to imagine that bologna is a cheap, working-class kind of food. This is because it's fairly inexpensive and often paired with ingredients like white bread and American cheese. Additionally, since it's easy and cheap to process, store, and serve, bologna quickly became a staple in institutions that needed to feed a lot of people cheaply and easily, such as schools and prisons. However, just because bologna isn't typically served on a baguette with Gruyere, doesn't mean bologna has always been a subpar variety of meat. That transition only came with the rise of the packaged food industry. Instead, bologna traces its roots right back to the city that shares its name, as well as its predecessor, Mortadella. In and around Bologna, Mortadella is still a beloved regional staple, a protected delicacy that requires skill and artistry to prepare. Clearly, bologna's ancestor receives much more respect than its Oscar Mayer counterpart does on this side of the Atlantic. While bologna can trace its roots to Italian mortadella, it is often associated with food culture in the United States.
It's just bologna.
However, bologna is not an all-American invention. It's not even the case that an American went to Italy, discovered mortadella, brought a recipe back home, and concocted bologna. Instead, like so many foods now labeled as all-American, bologna came over to the US with immigrants who spread their cuisine far and wide. Although we don't know for certain, it's believed that German immigrants can be credited with introducing bologna to the United States. The regions in which bologna food culture is prevalent in the US are the same areas that have historically been home to pockets of German immigrants. That said, other countries have their own claims on bologna too. For example, the Newfoundland Times in Canada claims that bologna is synonymous with the province. And they also eat bologna in Australia, where it is known as polony. The point? Despite what you might think, America certainly does not hold an exclusive claim on the concept of bologna. The grocery store lunch meat aisle typically contains ham, chicken, turkey, and of course bologna. You can pretty much reliably find Oscar Mayer products throughout the United States. But while that's the most prevalent type of bologna, it's not the only option that exists. Even if you're just looking at bologna products in the United States, you'll find numerous regional takes on this classic meat. So-called German bologna typically has a strong garlic flavor, for example. Meanwhile, Lebanon bologna comes from Amish country in Pennsylvania. It's made with an array of spices then smoked for a summer sausage-like consistency. Ring bologna is very much like regular sandwich bologna, but it comes in a large sausage ring case for bite-sized, rather than sandwich-sized slices. Sweet bologna has, you guessed it, a sweetener added, whether that's maple syrup, corn syrup, or plain sugar. Maybe it's because it was produced and sold so cheaply throughout the last century, or because you can't automatically identify what animal it came from. Whatever the case, bologna has developed a negative reputation as a mystery meat. And sure, you can't look at a slice of bologna the way you might a rack of ribs or ham hock. But that doesn't mean the US Department of Agriculture is just letting producers put any old meat into your meat. Indeed, bologna is not as mysterious as it seems. According to the USDA, bologna is grouped into the same category as hot dogs. For all food items in this group, the USDA requires that the maker clearly identify what kind of meat is in the item. Additionally, if the bologna contains meat byproducts, the USDA requires that they be named on the label too. In other words, this mystery is one you can solve with just a little reading. Yes, the USDA lumps hot dogs into the same category as bologna as far as food safety guidelines go. And yes, they both have more or less a similar consistency. They're both pale pink and emulsified meat products too. But hot dogs and bologna are not exactly the same, and it comes down to much more than just the size difference. Despite what you might think, hot dogs are not just smaller cylinders of bologna, and bologna is not just an oversized hot dog processed into slices. Despite the similarities, there are a number of differences in flavors, seasonings, and the final product that mark a significant distinction between hot dogs and bologna. For example, hot dogs are often smoked and may have mustard powder added to the recipe. Hot dogs often come with their casing intact, while bologna does not. Likewise, you're probably not going to find myrtle berries in your hot dog. At the end of the day, you could consider hot dogs and bologna to be siblings. They share a lot of the same DNA, but they're not identical. You've probably heard the story. Somewhere out there, there's a factory where they sweep the floor after the meat processing is finished and throw whatever they find into a vat, and that's bologna.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Horror stories surrounding the contents of bologna run rampant, and kids and adults alike joke about all the suspicious, nasty ingredients lurking in processed meat. However, just like the USDA ensures that bologna's ingredients aren't a mystery, it also guarantees that producers aren't just slapping a bologna label on anything they want. According to the USDA, bologna must be made from beef, pork, turkey, chicken, or a mix of these proteins. Furthermore, the USDA doesn't permit certain types of mechanically separated meat to be used, such as mechanically separated beef, which isn't considered safe for human consumption. Likewise, if a manufacturer uses a mechanical separator to remove meat from the bones for bologna and hot dog use, the machinery must meet certain specifications to guarantee that ground or crushed bones don't end up in your food. Children who come across the spelling of bologna for the first time might find themselves a little surprised. To most American ears, the word doesn't quite sound the way it's spelled. Surely bologna, with an EY, must be the proper spelling, right? Well, while that bologna is a slang term that sounds like this kind of food, it's not a word that came about in conjunction with bologna as a food. Instead, bologna is slang for nonsense, and it's a term that grew in popularity in the earlier part of the 1900s, when a New York politician began using it to describe federal bureaucracy. It's believed that the slang term may have been derived from the Irish word blarney, which also means nonsense.
Oh, baloney, old man.
So then why do we pronounce bologna like we do, and not like the Italian city for which the meat was named?
All right, how do you want to pronounce this word? Baloney! I don't know if you saw, there's a G in the word.
One linguist told HuffPost that this was just an instance of Americans replacing the ending I and A in Italian words with a Y. In much the same way that Italia becomes Italy, the pronunciation of the city of Bologna sounds as if it has an IA at the end, meaning it was subsequently Americanized into bologna. If you've scanned health-related headlines in the last few years, you may have gotten the impression that all deli meat, including bologna, is totally unhealthy. What's more, you may have concluded from the headlines that not only is deli meat bad for you, but it's downright dangerous, as it can cause all sorts of cancers. Whereas headlines like to dramatize the impacts that certain foods can have on our bodies, experts tend to be a little more restrained on their claims. One expert told the New York Times that although bologna isn't exactly great for you, you can eat it in moderation without any significant worry. Similarly, a nutritionist told USA Today that while prepackaged deli meat is high in preservatives and sodium, it can still be a source of protein in small quantities. However, if you already have a health concern such as high blood pressure, you may want to be extra cautious about your consumption. When buying any deli meat, you'd be better off choosing meat sliced at the deli counter rather than prepackaged options, which typically contain more preservatives and additives. For years, the common understanding has been that people shouldn't eat lunch meat while pregnant. If they did, the individuals and their unborn children were thought to be at risk for dangerous foodborne illnesses. In particular, listeria was a big worry, as it could lurk everywhere from unpasteurized milk to chicken salad and, yes, lunch meat. However, this is a broad generalization that overlooks some specific details, so it shouldn't necessarily be taken at face value. For example, the USDA clarifies that lunch meat is only a risk if it hasn't been thoroughly reheated. So while pregnant people shouldn't eat a piece of bologna right out of the fridge, you should be safe if you put the slice on a sub sandwich and reheat it to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. One doctor who spoke with Healthline agreed, further noting that heat should reduce the risk of listeria, and fried bologna is delicious.
Spam. It's a lot of meat, but not a lot of money.
For anyone who's had a taste of both Spam and bologna, the idea that they could be the same product is clearly false. However, it's still a misconception that comes up, particularly among those who deem all processed meats to be mystery meats, including these ones. The distinction is most evident when you look at their ingredient lists. Spam contains 6 ingredients: pork, salt, water, potato starch, sugar, and sodium nitrate. All of these items are mixed together, loaded into Spam cans, cooked inside, and sent on their way.
I don't like Spam! Don't make a fuss, dear. I'll have your Spam. I love it. I'm having Spam.
Easy peasy. In contrast, bologna contains far more ingredients, including many that the average consumer may not be able to confidently identify by name. And, of course, the way in which it is cooked and processed is completely different to Spam. It's not usually canned, for one thing. So while the naysayers might hold these two foods in similarly low esteem, it's definitely not fair to say that they're the same thing. Truth is, Spam and bologna are very different.
Pink circles of meat slathered with mayo, nestled between two slices of soft bread. It's an iconic image for sure. Although it was named after the Italian city of Bologna, this kind of meat is very different from what the Italians had in mind. The Italian version, known as mortadella, is a cured sausage made from pork and lard, spiced with black pepper and often containing pistachios. In fact, one explanation for the name mortadella says it comes from the mortar and pestle used to grind bits of pistachio and myrtle berries into the meat. The Italians revere the meat so much that, in 1661, the Pope gave it a legal definition: a subtly seasoned delicacy made of lean pork speckled with lumps of lard. Currently, its status is protected by the European Union, meaning companies bearing the label must follow a precise formula for producing it. Mortadella has a pretty incredible history, too. This cured sausage fed the Roman army, employed 10,000 townspeople in its production in the Middle Ages, compelled Napoleon to bring it back to France, and was even tasted by Buffalo Bill during his time in Italy. When mortadella hit U.S. soil in the late 19th century, Americans revamped the recipe and created bologna, made with either beef, chicken, pork, or some combination of the three. Some varieties contained premium cuts, while others were made from ground-up parts and trimmings. And sure, bologna is affordable and flavorful, but what are you actually consuming when you eat it? Well, it all depends on the brand. Go for premium bologna like that from Boar's Head, and you'll get hand-trimmed cuts of spiced beef for around $8 per pound. Switch to the stuff sold in plastic containers, and it's closer to $2.50 per pound. Why the plunge in price? In the case of the cheaper version, it seems that this is because mechanically separated chicken is the prime ingredient, rather than beef. If you're wondering what mechanically separated chicken might be, the National Chicken Council suggests that you imagine a rotisserie chicken. Rather than the whole bird, however, this is made up of what's left after you rip off the breasts, wings, legs, and thighs, essentially the meat scraps clinging to the bone. The chicken's bones and skeletal muscles are then crushed and forced through a sieve to create soft tissue with a cake batter consistency. That's the stuff used to make bologna. In the past, bologna was made from discarded or fatty meat parts, and even organ meat in some cases. As a result, it was cheaper than ham or salami, making it more accessible and popular during the Great Depression. As bologna's popularity spread, however, some began to view the meat as unclean food made primarily for the poor. Even beyond the Great Depression, bologna continued to act as an inexpensive meat, often utilized by the government when large numbers of people needed feeding. Such groups included migrant workers in the mid-20th century, many who turned to food pantries or soup kitchens for food, and those incarcerated in the country's prisons. When the economy hit a low in 2009, restaurants even brought back bologna sandwiches as a way to defray costs. Fast forward a few years, and many butchers and restaurateurs are trying to rehabilitate bologna's reputation as a cheap meat. In 2014, Chef David Chang spoke to GQ about artisan bolognas, claiming his restaurant served one dish made from duck bologna seasoned with Chinese spices. One meat processing company, Peachy Foods, based in Pennsylvania, also produces custom bologna in a variety of flavors, including teriyaki and honey barbecue. Moreover, some restaurants have begun including bologna on their charcuterie boards. But will bologna finally be transformed from a cheap cafeteria staple to a genuine culinary delicacy? Only time will tell.
Crazy for bologna? Craving a sandwich? Or maybe you're just cooking on a budget. Either way, these are the mistakes you should never make again. For decades, the humble bologna sandwich has been a staple in packed lunches across the United States. Often, a bologna sandwich will be a slapped-together combination of white bread, bologna, and a condiment such as ketchup or mayonnaise. A bologna sandwich is only as good as you make it, however. And if you make it boring, well, Let's just say you get what you deserve. There are plenty of ways to mix up the standard bologna sandwich. For example, you could swap out the regular bread slices for something different like sourdough or even a toasted bagel. The bologna will also taste better if you fry it on the griddle a little bit to bring out the flavor. From there, your imagination is the only thing holding you back. The popular New Orleans restaurant Turkey and the Wolf serves a griddle-fried bologna sandwich with American cheese, hot mustard, Duke's mayo, shredded lettuce, and vinegar potato chips stacked between 2 slices of buttered bread. Nothing boring about that, right? But what if you don't have a bunch of other ingredients to hand? Well, chef and television personality Alton Brown suggests making a sandwich that is a combination of fried bologna and cold bologna right out of the fridge. The different textures and flavors shine through the simple sandwich, meaning that it needs precious little else to make it pop. Bologna is often thought of as a last resort option when it comes to lunch meat. Sure, you might scoff down a bologna sandwich if it's served to you, but it probably wasn't your first choice for lunch, and it probably won't be next time either. However, if you think outside of the sandwich, you can transform bologna into a meat that's just as delicious as those pricier cuts at the butcher's counter. If you're interested in making your bologna a bit fancier, you could always do what Grillin' Fools does and make burnt ends out of thick dices of bologna. Usually, burnt ends are made by overcooking pieces of beef brisket until they are extremely tender. The recipe suggests slathering chunks of more affordable bologna meat in butter, barbecue sauce, and honey, and then smoking them twice to get a similar effect to brisket. It might even inspire you to make your own bologna at home using a meat grinder and backyard smoker. The most foolproof way to change a bologna hater's mind is to dig out the frying pan. Bologna has a soft texture that doesn't resemble any other meats, and the mouthfeel can be a little unsettling for picky eaters, which is why frying it is the way to go. Think about it. Unfried bologna is pretty much the same as a cold hot dog. It's just not that appetizing. Meanwhile, the heat from a grill helps to caramelize the sugars in the bologna meat, amping up the sweetness. It also adds variety in texture by having the soft interior complemented with a crispy exterior. If someone is bad-mouthing bologna to you, try offering them a grilled or fried bologna sandwich. They'll be eating their words before they've finished. When you get home from the grocery store, you might just throw your bologna in your fridge's meat drawer without a second thought. But this is a common mistake. It's important to remember that whenever you buy bologna, you should keep it totally separate from any raw meats. Even in your supermarket cart, it should be placed in a different shopping bag and stored in a different area of your refrigerator to prevent any accidental contamination. If you're dealing with both bologna and raw meat at the same time while cooking, you should make sure to use different cutting boards and knives. The last thing you need is for an innocent slice of bologna to give you a bout of food poisoning.
I'm dying.
I was dying earlier today, and then I died. Now I'm dead.